Welcome back to the Christian I Ching. This is the lecture on the archetype. My goal in this unit is to describe the organization of a typical archetype, one of the 64 patterns that's described in the Christian I Ching. So as I've talked about, archetypes are these fundamental patterns. There are 64 fundamental patterns, and taken as a whole, the understanding of the I Ching is that these describe everything that can ever happen in the universe. In the Christian I Ching, these are called archetypes. In more traditional I Chings, these patterns are called hexagrams, but I'm going to use hexagrams in a slightly different way. So from our perspective, an archetype is one of the 64 patterns described by the Christian I Ching. This is a list of the first 32 of the archetypes, just to give you a sense of what they look like, not just their names. So you can see their first 32, they go from 1 to 32, and they have various names starting with God, wisdom, and kind of going up to archetype 32, which is duration. There's another 32, but this is as many as I could put on this slide, and I just want to give you an idea of what they look like. Let's take a look at a sample of one of these archetypes. So if you open the Christian I Ching and you turn to page 166, we can take a look at archetype number 30. This is just an example. We could be looking at any one of those, but they all look the same. So let's choose archetype 30. The first thing we notice in the archetype is the number. And the number is the index number of the archetype. So if I tell you to look up archetype 30, you can easily find it in the Christian I Ching. You just kind of flip through the book until you find archetype 30, or you can look it up in the table of contents in this case, and see that archetype 30 starts on page 166. Either way, it's very easy to find a particular archetype once you know its index number. And the archetype number is standard across all versions of the I Ching. So if you pick up any version of the I Ching and you look up the 30 pattern number 30, which they're going to call a hexagram, and I'm going to call an archetype, but if you look up number 30, it's going to be the same underlying pattern. So it should be recognizable regardless of which I Ching you use. Next thing you notice is the name of the archetype. Now the name of the archetype is not standard across the different versions, so different I Chings are going to call number 30 something different. Hopefully it's going to be at least somewhat similar. So for example, this one, archetype 30, which I call light, Wilhelm Baines calls it clinging and fire, so fire and light are somewhat alike. Pearson calls it the net, which doesn't appear at all like either fire or the light. And Barrett calls it clarity. So clarity you can kind of see as being somewhat similar to the light. But in any case, don't expect there to be any agreement on the name, but do expect there to be agreement on the index. But the name can be important because a lot of times even the name of the archetype alone can give you some very quick information about what the archetype is trying to tell you. The next thing that we see in the archetype is the pictogram, the hexagram. So the hexagram is a pictographic representation of the archetype. And the hexagram is going to be standard across all versions of the I Ching. So if you pick up anybody else's I Ching and you look up number 30, they may call it something else, but the pictographic representation shown there, the hexagram shown for that, is going to look exactly like mine. It's going to be 6 lines. They're going to be the same 6 lines in the same order. Hexagram comes from the Greek word for 6, and it's called hexagram because there are 6 lines that compose the hexagram. We always count lines from the bottom up, so if I'm ever referring to the second line, I don't mean the second line from the top, I mean the second line from the bottom. And if I say the first line in hexagram, I'm always talking about the bottom line in the hexagram. So there are 6 lines going from 1 to 6, 6 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. Any one of these can be either a solid line, which is often called a yang line, or an open line, which is often called a yin line. I'm going to try to be consistent in this course about calling these solid and open lines, but there are a few places where I do use the terminology yang line and yin line, but by and large we're going to refer to these as solid lines and open lines. So again, a hexagram consists of 6 lines, any one of which can be solid, any one of which can be open. They can all be open, they can all be solid, and they're numbered 1 through 6 starting from the bottom of the hexagram. We can also look at hexagrams in a different way. We can look at them as two trigrams. Tri means three in Greek, so tri has 3 lines in it. So we can think of a hexagram, instead of being 6 individual lines, as being 2 trigrams stacked on top of each other. So an upper trigram stacked on top of a lower trigram. The trigrams also have names and attributes and images associated with them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it in this course, but you can be aware of that, and sometimes when you're doing a reading and you're looking at your 2 trigrams that you received in the hexagram, you can look at them and see what they say, and maybe the family member has some relevance, or maybe the image is relevant to what you're thinking about. So I'll talk a little bit about those in the archetype. But we don't spend a lot of time with that, so you don't have to try to memorize the name of all the trigrams, or for that matter, don't try to memorize the name of all the 64 archetypes either. You can look them up and read about them when you need them. The next thing that we notice in the archetype is the scripture reading. Most versions of the I Ching have some kind of a reading that is used to kind of get across the general idea of the pattern that archetype or that hexagram represents. In the traditional readings, it's readings that don't really have a lot of meaning to us. So, for example, a traditional reading for Archetype 30 that comes from Wilhelm Baines is: the clinging, perseverance furthers, it brings success. Care of the cow brings good fortune. So maybe it's just because I grew up in New York City, but taking care of cows as a way of bringing good fortune doesn't really speak to me. So what I've done is, throughout the Christian I Ching, is I replaced these traditional readings that really aren't that meaningful to us with biblical readings that I think get across the same sense and are going to have a lot more meaning to us. So, for example, in Archetype 30, instead of using that traditional reading, I use a reading from John, which I think speaks to us in the same way that traditional reading spoke to people in China 3,000 years ago. Next thing you'll see is a description of the reading, and this is really me trying to call out some of the important points of the reading. It's not to say that those are the only important points of the reading, but they're saying that from the perspective of this archetype, this is why I've chosen this reading, and those are the things that you should really pay attention to as being relevant for this particular archetype. Then we get to a description of the hexagram, and this is one of the few places where I will look at the hexagram as the 2 trigrams. I'll usually discuss each one of the 2 trigrams and maybe bring out a few points about them. You're not usually going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's always helpful to look at this, and you might find some interesting information, some interesting images that come forth, some archetypal images, some things like that. So read this section, but probably don't overly focus on it, I would say. The next area is an area that you will look at quite a bit, and that is the archetype description itself. And this is the actual message of the archetype, and it's always going to be in the pattern of, there is a time to do this and this and this, now is that time. So what you're going to do is look at, what is this archetype telling you? So in this particular case, it's saying that if you have received this archetype, the message God is giving you is that there is a time to offer oneself totally to the light, to cling to what is right, etc., to be bearers of the light to all we meet. So you can kind of, read this, and this is really what God is speaking to you in response to the question that you asked. Now you're going to see a section called the lines, and the lines is subdivided into 6 subsections, 1 for each line. And we're going to talk about moving lines soon, but when you receive a response, you're going to receive it as an archetype, but you're also going to get a notation on which of the 6 lines is considered to be moving. I'll talk more about that later. But when you receive a message that says, for example, you've gotten a hexagram for archetype 30, and lines 1 and 3 are moving, then you would read the section in the lines area that corresponds to lines 1 and 3. Now remember, when I say lines 1 and 3, I'm always counting from the bottom, so I'm talking about line 1 being the bottom line and the third line being 2 lines above that. So if I was to know that those 2 lines were moving, which we'll find out soon how to know that, then you would read the section that corresponds to a moving line in the first position and a moving line in the third position. You may get no moving lines in a particular reading, or you could get all moving lines. All of those are possible. But most commonly, I would say you're going to get one or two, maybe three moving lines. It usually doesn't go much beyond that, but it can. Let's look a little bit more closely at the idea of moving lines. Now, the opposite of a moving line is a static line. So a static line is a line that you can consider to be a low energy line. So you're always going to, when you ask a question, you're going to be given these 6 lines. You're going to be told which ones are open, which ones are solid. So you may be told if the first line is an open line, the second line is a solid line, the third line is an open line, whatever it is. And independent of that, you're going to be told which ones are open, which ones are static and which ones are moving. So, you'll see that when we get to the section on interpreting the stones, how you know which ones are which. But every line has one of two forms, either open or solid, and one of two energy states, either static or moving. And we don't really spend time thinking about which lines are static. What we want to know is which lines are moving, because that's going to point to certain areas in the archetype that we need to read about. This is a pictographic representation of the form that I use in the workbook. And in the workbook, I'll have places for you to note the 6 lines you got, and I'll also have a little circle next to each one of those. And I use that circle to represent the moving line. So if I put an X in the circle, then that line is assumed to be a moving line. So if there's no X in the circle, then it's assumed to be a static line. Like I said, we don't really care too much about the static lines, but the moving lines are very important to us for a number of reasons. So this particular note that I've made in my workbook would consist of the pictogram, the 6 lines of the hexagram that I received, and notations on which ones are moving. So in this case, the moving lines would be in the first, second, third, and 6th position. Remember, we always count from the bottom on up. So the first position means the lowest, the 6th position means the highest. If I know that I've received archetype 30, or I know I've received a pictogram for archetype 30 with moving lines in the first, second, third, and 6th position, then that would tell me which sections of the lines general section to look at. So again, the line section has 6 subsections. I'm going to read the ones that correspond to the moving lines that I received. Now, the overall process for the I Ching discernment goes like this. You start out by, and each one of these requires a fair amount of effort. I'm going to go through each one of these in a lot more depth. I just want to give you an overview. You're going to start out by asking a question. You're going to pray for an answer. You're going to receive an answer. And the answer is going to consist of 6 lines. Any of those lines can be either open or closed, and any one of those 6 lines can be either static or moving. And the pictogram is going to point you to an archetype. So you're going to basically get the picture of the pictographic representation of the archetype. And then the moving lines are going to point you to the appropriate line sections to read. So the pictogram points you to which archetype to read, and within that, the moving lines point you to which of the moving lines section to read. Okay, we're getting ready to start actually using the I Ching, so the first thing I'd like you to do is write down 3 questions that you might like to ask the I Ching. Don't worry about them a lot, because we're going to look at them in more depth later. But for now, just think, what 3 questions would you like to ask the I Ching? If you can only come up with 1, that's okay. If you can come up with 4 or 5, that's fine too. Write them all down. But try to come up with 3 questions that you would like the I Ching to ask the I Ching. And then join me again for the next lecture. I'm Roger Sessions, and I hope you'll be back soon.